Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Majors and Quinn YouTube channel. My name is Annie. I'm the events coordinator at Majors and Quinn, which is an independent bookstore in Minneapolis, Minnesota. If this is your first virtual event with us, welcome. If this is not your first virtual or in-person event, welcome back. Thank you so much for supporting our events program, as it has taken many forms, virtual and otherwise, in the past year and a half. It's been great to feature so many authors from both in Minnesota and from all over the country, and we are super excited about the conversation we have coming up for you tonight about the book Becoming Abolitionists by Derecka Purnell. I'm just going to introduce our speakers very quickly, and I do want you to know that if you're watching on YouTube, you do have the ability to ask questions of the speakers. We will get to some questions at the end of the hour. Simply log in to your YouTube account and use the live chat function, and we will be able to see those questions throughout the event, and we'll take as many as we can at the end of the hour. Also, just let us know where you're watching from. Say hello. It's great to always see there's usually one random international viewer. So if that's you, let us know. And if you are interested in purchasing a copy of Becoming Abolitionists, we do have them, of course, at Majors and Quinn. So give us a call. We ship anywhere throughout the country and internationally. And I will put all that information in the chat for you. So our speakers tonight are Derecka Purnell and Dr. Jelani Cobb. Going to introduce them now. Derecka Purnell is a lawyer, writer, organizer, and author of Becoming Abolitionists, Police, Protests, and the Pursuit of Freedom. She works to end police and prison violence by providing legal assistance, research, and training in community-based organizations through an abolitionist framework. She's from St. Louis and lives between the DMV and New York City. She is currently a columnist at The Guardian, a Margaret Burroughs Fellow for the Social Justice Initiative's Portal Project, and the University of Illinois Chicago, and the Scholar in Residence with Institute for Just Society at Columbia Law School. Derecka, thanks so much for being here. And in conversation with her, we have Jelani Cobb, who's been contributing to The New Yorker since 2012 and became a staff writer in 2015. He writes frequently about race, politics, history, and culture. His most recent book is The Substance of Hope, Barack Obama and the Paradox of Progress. He won the 2015 Sidney Hillman Prize for Opinion and Analysis Journalism for his columns on race, the police, and injustice. He teaches at Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. Jelani, thank you so much for being part of this event. I can't wait to hear this conversation, and I will be back at the end of the hour to take questions. Until then, have a great event.
Thank you. So, Derecka, it's funny. I guess we should give context to the good people of Minneapolis that the digital technology has made it miraculously possible for us to talk across the great distance that separates us, which is currently like 2 city blocks.
Right.
We could literally yell, probably. We could probably yell this conversation across to each other, but nobody watching this would be able to hear it. So I think because this book is both autobiographical and also historical and analytical about a very specific policy, a set of policy prerogatives, I thought it'd be good to just kind of approach the questions in the same way. And so, for my own way into this conversation, you and I met in Ferguson in 2014, and I don't remember what kind of gas station that was that had been on that corner.
It
was a Quick Trip. Okay.
Quick
So
Trip.
There was a Speedway that was in what's become George Floyd Square. And so I've never been able to remember which gas station was.
Which gas station?
Terrible. Like I'm mixing up my cataclysms at this point. So just can you take me back to where you were at that moment that we just happened to strike up a conversation in that basically People's Square next to the Quick Trip in Ferguson?
Yes. Well, actually, it wasn't so random. I think I have been following your work, and I saw that you made an announcement on Facebook that you were going to Ferguson.
Mhm.
And at that point, I was very protective of people who were like coming in to, I didn't even like that you were a journalist or historian. None of that mattered. I was like, why are these people coming to Ferguson?
Mhm.
Because I watched people come and like take pictures and then say they were like doing things and sort of leaving. And so anyone who I saw said they were coming to Ferguson, I was like, who are you? Why are you coming? What are you trying to do? And so when you were like, I'm a journalist. I cover, these sort of events, they matter. All this stuff is happening. I was like, okay, well, and then you asked, I guess, where I would be, and I asked where you would be. And it turns out, I think we were both on West Florissant. So right before I went off to college, I had been living near West Florissant in Chambers, which is a few blocks away from the uprising. And I was on my way home to get all of my furniture off of West Florissant to go to law school. So I was like in town saying my goodbyes. I figured I had made it. I was on my way to Harvard. Like, this is like, I'm about to be the civil rights lawyer. And then this uprising happened. So when I met you, I talk about it a little bit in the book because you said something that I find very, very funny and very true. But now so much has changed. It's shifted a bit. You said, these are some regular ass Black people out here rising up. In New York City, there's like a protest, all the time, everywhere, there are things popping up. I hadn't quite seen anything like this happen, in America. And I found that to be so eye-opening, especially for me as someone who's a Midwesterner who used to come to New York City and feel out of place. Like, look at all these people, where they going? Everyone's moving so fast. It's people on trains and there's cars, there's honking, there's noise all the time. And so to hear that, I felt a level of curiosity and a level of affirmation that what was taking place was very, very special. And it's been interesting. I think you and I talked about this early this year. There's so many other uprisings that's happened since Ferguson have taken place in these suburban centers outside of the urban centers, right? And so it's interesting thinking about that now in context versus then, when it was like, why is this tiny suburb outside of St. Louis like a catalyst for this national movement? And now we look, outside of Cleveland, outside of Minneapolis, we look at all these places and we see people who are rising up. So yeah, that was the context for our initial meeting.
Yeah, I think that prompted, a kind of very dry joke from me, because we were talking about Ferguson being right next to a community called Country Club, and Country Club being majority Black. And I said that one of the concerns, one of the dynamics that is going on here is the suburbanization of poverty, and policies that people typically associated with quote unquote inner cities that are now taking place in suburbs. And I said, rest assured, when you name a community Country Club, it's not because you intend to invite Black people in.
Yes.
So, another thing.
Wait, really
Sorry,
quickly, to that point, it's also a Beverly Hills, right? So you have Town and Country, you have Country Club, you have Beverly Hills, Missouri, which is all Black. Right. A tiny municipality, also outside of St. Louis, plagued with the same issues as Ferguson, with police, poverty, decimation of housing. I mean, all of the same things as this tiny Beverly Hills community, right? You see that all around in North County.
One of the interesting things, before we move on, one of the interesting things that I learned in Ferguson, that's what I knew in a general sense, but I did not know nearly as concretely as I learned in Ferguson, was just the general distorting effect that the media has. The fact that media is there, and sometimes that's good. Sometimes, in the case of protests, the fact that there are cameras rolling may make officers inclined to refrain from the most egregious behavior, because they know how this will look, on a news broadcast. That wasn't the case in Ferguson. People were tear gassing police. Tear gassing journalists intentionally. There. But the other part of it was that, because so much of the media, and huge portion of it from abroad, more than I even anticipated, from European countries, I believe there are people from Australia who were there, like people from all over the world that were there to cover Ferguson, was that when, in the absence of there being something going on, would kind of just drum up something to happen and then film what was happening. And so the fact that the media was there was creating a story that was being then broadcast as if this was an organic development in that community.
Right. That's a good point. That's a really, really good point. I hadn't thought about it in quite that sense. I remember the first time ever leaving the country was in 2015, and I went to Mozambique. And when I got to the hotel, the front page of the paper in this Mozambican hotel was the Ferguson uprising.
Wow.
And I was like, in Portuguese, like this is what it's the headline news right now, in March 2015 in this this Southwest African country. Southeast African country. I was so surprised and very grateful to international media, because that helped to build a level of international solidarity with some of the resistance. Some of our best resistance tactics actually came from people who had regularly experienced tear gas, right, under the state of Israel, under South Africa, in Brazil, right? So that media, social media, then like the more traditional forms of media, were able to help us build an international movement, at the time, towards police reform and accountability. And it's been interesting watching that shift since 2014.
Mm-hmm. So tell me a little bit about, the book is Becoming Abolitionists, and, this is a personal and an intellectual journey. So tell me a little bit about the starting place. You start out the book saying, and conclude the book saying, we call the police for nearly everything. So tell me about that.
Yeah, well, I tried to think about when this journey started, and the more I thought about where it began, and the further I had to go back, right? And so I think one easy story to tell is that, well, I was someone who was a police reformer, or I was someone who believed in police, and then I became an abolitionist. But what's true for me, and probably true for lots of people, is that we have these unexamined ideas and commitments to lots of institutions in our society, and police are one of them. And so I grew up with police being these normal, regular fixtures in my life, right? They were my mom's friends, and they were people who chased my friends, right? There were people who showed up whenever there was a crisis happening, and there were people who took us from our home and we were removed and put in foster care. And so they played all of these different roles in my life, and I never asked where they come from. Do we need them? Why do we have to have them? But I knew that we were afraid of them. And I meant like people in my community, from the East African refugees who were fleeing war in Ethiopia and Somalia, to the Black boys who were Crips, who lived at Rucker, who lived at Hickory, right? So I knew that my mom was afraid of them, even though she had known some of them, had friendships, had relationships. So it's a messier journey than even what the book sometimes like allowed me to write. And what I tried to say and be honest is that, I saw people become cops because they wanted to be better than the cops that they interacted when they were young Black kids, right? They wanted to be like the good kind of a cop instead of like a white racist cop. And they thought that entering the police academy would be one way to do that. And it also sounded like a much better option than the grave or the cage, which is what so many Black people in my neighborhood ended up going to, unfortunately. And so I had these unexamined, messy ideas, but one thing that was consistent is that fear. And so through organizing, through activism, through study, through being around people who are much more curious about the origins of police, about the purpose of police, I was pushed to develop a political analysis, right, of what police actually do and why it made sense that police were responsible and showing up for so many different parts of my life, right? From like the foster care to the crises, to the medical stuff, to the fights at home, why police were the constant response. And then you realize like, oh yeah, police are a default cheap option to all of these crises that are created by inequality that we actually need much more investment in order to undermine. And so that journey like took place over a course of several years and continues to take place. Like I'm still thinking about abolition. I'm still thinking about the role of police. I'm learning. I have new ideas about the function of police and what they do in society. And so that is what the book tries to show, that part of how that journey began, and to show that I'm definitely still on it.
Mm. So talk to me it's still early on, so we can be clear with like all the viewers. You define abolition for me.
Sure. So when I say abolition, especially in this conversation, I'm talking about the abolition of the prison industrial complex. And so the abolition of the prison industrial complex, to me, it means to reduce the reasons why people think they need police, to reduce the carceral state, right? To actually shrink the carceral state, to reduce the reasons why people need police, and then to work to build lasting solutions to harm and punishment, as critical resistance says, to build relationships, to build communities, to build institutions that are capable of thriving, to make sure that people can live with dignity and peace. And so it's a destruction of this system that we're calling the prison industrial complex, or the carceral state. And it's the building up of systems and people, communities, families, neighborhoods that lead us to a place where we can thrive instead of just surviving under oppressive regimes in this country.
So you view this not simply in the context of your experiences in St. Louis, in and around St. Louis, but as part of a much longer and complicated historical narrative. Can you give us some context for this?
Yes, of course. Well, I'm very, very lucky that I did not have to be the originator of an idea for abolition, right? There are people who've been thinking and theorizing and organizing around abolition even decades before I was even born, right? And so it's so interesting that when I was a kid, I would hear about Angela Davis, right? My mom would tell me about, these Black feminist heroes of hers, but I didn't realize that these were people who had abolitionist politics and identities and who were organizing around liberation this particular way. So many of the people who I had known at household names, I didn't actually get a chance to engage their work until much, much, much later. And so I see myself as an inheritor of this grand tradition of people who have been using abolition as a way to fight for freedom. And the one reason why they use abolition is because they're drawing from the slavery abolitionist tradition, where people were fighting to undermine the institution of slavery. We were fighting for its abolition. We're fighting for, some of them, not all of them, and I talk about this in the book, we're fighting for the liberation of Black people and oppressed people in the United States. And so drawing on that tradition, people, especially, people who are a part of critical resistance, have adopted that to show that, well, there are all these legacies, all these remnants of slavery that remain, and that's bound up in our criminal legal system. Like, that includes police and prosecutors and the surveillance state, right? And if we truly want to continue to abolish the system of slavery that was wedded to the plantation, right? How do we continue to eliminate and abolish slavery in its lesser forms, which includes prisons, which includes police? And so I think drawing on that history is so important, because in the past, to be an abolitionist was polarizing, right? It was not the romantic idea we have of an abolitionist today, right? The people who we now know who are on the right side of history, most of them, not all of them. But now we talk about the anti-slavery movement. The people who are ultimately the heroes are the abolitionists. The people who are the villains are the people who want to uphold the Confederacy. So what it took to be an abolitionist rather, then required so much risk and sacrifice and putting yourself sort of out there around this unpopular, radical idea that Black people should not be enslaved, right? And so I think that now when people are using that term, they're tapping into that history. They may understand that, abolition right now may feel radical. It's unpopular. People don't like it. They reduce the idea to a slogan, or that it's politically immature. But as the fight continues to go, right, the abolitionists today, I believe and I know, are going to be on the right side of history for what they're fighting for. So I see that in that broader tradition, even something like the civil rights movement, right? It was not a popular movement to be fighting for civil rights, in the depending on the long history of the civil rights movement from the 40s to the 60s. But when we talk about the civil rights, if you go to any Black church and they talk about the civil rights movement now, what they say we was fighting, we was marching. No, we wasn't. Y'all was not fighting and marching. Look at your yearbooks. You was not in these streets, right? But that's not the way we tell that story. So I want to ensure that I and the people that I organize with, that we're on the right side of history.
So I think that, for people who are in the conversation, or people who are viewing or kind of hearing the counter that you hear on the other side of this is about crime, and saying that, there are people who are in jeopardy, people who are murder victims, or the communities with the highest incarceration rates also have the highest rates of of people who are dying by homicide and so on. And so you talk about in the book that this is not a statement of naivete, that people understand or have even experienced themselves these sorts of dynamics. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about this and kind of how crime factors in.
Yeah, of course. So I've never met an abolitionist who's pro-crime. Never. I've never met an abolitionist who's pro-murder. I've never met an abolitionist who's pro someone who's able to commit harm and not face any accountability. So when I usually encounter those counters, I encounter them as straw men. I encounter people who say, you really don't care about, survivors or victims. And it's just wrong. It's just wrong. Many of us are survivors of violence, right? Like live like right now or experiencing and surviving all kinds of violence, interpersonal violence, institutional violence. So that's one. But when I organize the people who I find to ask these questions, about murder, around sexual violence, about will they be safe, I don't experience the same sort of straw man arguments when they talk about crime. When I talk to people in St. Louis about abolition, St. Louis is usually on the list of cities like Newark, Detroit, DC, Chicago as having higher murder rates, right? Gary, yes. Mm-hmm. So when they ask, what about homicides? It's coming from a real place because they are vulnerable to real violence, like from strangers, from their neighbors, from their lovers, and from police, like including police. And removing police as an option just seems so scary when you have a homicide rate as high as St. Louis. But then when you also learn that, lots of these places with high homicide rates also have some of the highest rates per capita of police. Look at Puerto Rico, right? Look at St. Louis. St. Louis of the continent of the United States the city has one of the highest per capita presence of police. And so there's not the correlation if we have more police then we're going to have less homicide, because police don't stop homicides, right? They can sometimes put people in jail who are accused of killing someone. Sometimes the clearance rate has declined, right? So when I say clearance rates, means how many people have been arrested and charged, not even convicted of killing someone. They're less than like 50%. In places in neighborhoods in St. Louis, it's as low as 30%. So we have to ask ourselves, are we comfortable with police getting billions of dollars to solve, not even to solve, to make 30% arrests and 30% of the homicides that we currently have? Because that is our current situation. Or do we want to take time to get to the underlying causes of harm, including homicide, right? Which is the guns that we have in this country, right? Gun access is a huge one. Patriarchy is a huge one, right? One of the main reasons why people kill each other is because of toxic masculinity. Something you said have offended my manhood, and now you have to die. The second reason why people die in this country is when a man tries to control the sexuality of a woman, who wants to control who she sleeps with or who she may be attracted to or who is attracted to her, right? One of the second leading cause of homicides. And so police cannot arrest people over toxic masculinity. They help perpetuate, they contribute to it, right? They contribute to this level of violence. They can't stop that interpersonal violence that takes place in the home. They're contributors. If you look at domestic violence rates among police, they are 2 to 4 times higher than the general population. So what about the violence that the partners of cops, like what about them? Do they also matter? Are they also not survivors? Like, should we hold on to this institution of policing if we care about survivors and we're willing to let those rates soar through the roof? And so I think abolitionists are trying to make very, very clear to people that not only are we committed to the eradication of police and prisons, right, as solutions to harm and violence, we're also committed to getting to the actual root causes of harm and violence, which we know, right? We know about patriarchy, we know about homophobia, we know about sexism and misogyny, right? We know that xenophobia, when there's a rise in war, there's a rise in xenophobia, and that leads to attacks of people who are undocumented or people who are refugees. So we have so many answers at our fingertips. It's about whether we have the political will and commitment to undermine that harm. And I think that we can. And I'm excited that people are going to continue to fight for that.
Yeah, I think that in Newark, where I've done a lot of reporting, it was somewhere around 40% of the calls that come in for the police department are domestic violence calls, But given, the kind of historic high rates of domestic violence among police, it then means, what is the possibility that the person responding to that call is someone who has perpetrated that same kind of violence in their home or in their own personal intimate relations, I should say. So, but you also say that you talk in the book about the path that led you away from the ideas of reform. Can you talk about kind of how you evaluated those ideas, or how you once kind of subscribed to them, and then the developments that made you move beyond that?
Yeah, of course. Well, like I sort of said in the beginning, it wasn't as if I was committed to reform, right? I was committed to trying to figure out how to make the violence stop. That was what I was most committed to. And so at the time, especially during the Ferguson uprising, there were all these ideas that were coming out about how to make the police violence stop, right? So it's, we just need more community policing. We need more body cameras. We need more diversity. We need police to see Black people and poor people as human beings, so they can just see their humanity. Then maybe they won't pull the trigger. They'll think twice before they pull them over. Or we need to eliminate bias and racial profiling. And the more that I studied a lot of these reforms, the more that I was introduced to people who had studied these reforms, who had watched their implementation. And even with the rise of police convictions, for example, which was another big, we don't talk about it as reform, but there's this idea that if we can only increase police convictions after they kill someone, then that will then send a message to all the other police that you can't essentially get away with murder. And so police convictions started increasing for like the first time in like 50 or 60 years. But the number of police killings didn't necessarily decline, right? It wasn't as if someone was going to pull out their gun and say, wait, Peter Liang was convicted of killing Akai Gurley, and so let me not pull the trigger, right? That's not how it works, especially since the Supreme Court protects the cops' split-second decision-making is in the act of, stopping, apprehending, arresting someone, and using physical, deadly force to stop them. And so I was watching these convictions increase, and I was watching the killings continue. I was watching consent decrees take off in more cities than ever, and the killings continued, right? I was watching the Ferguson Police Department become more diverse, hire more Black cops, get more Black people in leadership. And I was still listening to people being evicted from their homes for complaining about police violence in that city, right? I was watching the Department of Justice defend this reluctant pace of the Ferguson Police Department to change in court, right? I was watching the community of activists try to say, hey, they're not listening to us. They're arresting us when we ask them a question about, their judgments of. I was watching all of these reforms be implemented, watching new body cameras put on the chests of different cops, watch them turn it off, watch cities deny footage to people who were requesting to access it, right? I was watching Sam DuBose get killed in Ohio by Ray Tensing on body camera, and watching Ray Tensing get charged multiple times by a prosecutor. And then not only being 2 mistrials happen, to then sue and get nearly $500,000 back from his employer for time off. So I was watching us win all of these reforms. The violence continued, the harassments continued, the sexual misconduct continued, right? All of the things that we thought that these reforms would alleviate continues to happen. We see that today, right? I don't know if you saw earlier, this video went viral of these 2 cops, throwing a man out of the New York City subway because he asked him to put on a mask. Like, he's asking him to put on a mask. And what are they doing? Throwing him out. And literally throwing him out, saying, you're being disruptive. Because he asked the cops to put on a mask in a pandemic, right? And so watching all of these reforms, watching the police continue to get more and more funding, more and more legitimacy, more and more airtime in the news, and then see the violence persist. And so at that point, it's like, well, we can continue to try to do the same thing and get to the same results, or we can try to save lives. But these reforms are not saving lives.
Mm-hmm. So there's a couple of things to think about here, like a few things to think about here. But One of the things, I talked with a lawyer once who was defending a cop who had shot a person in the course of a traffic stop. And he said, he gave me a perspective from a cop's vantage point, which was interesting. He was charged with defending this person. But he said, look, the problem in this country is not policing. The problem is guns. And he said, if you have a country in which there are literally more guns than there are people, you're going to have a police force that is paranoid. And in any given circumstance, for executing the most routine parts of police work, they are operating under the suspicion that this person could very well have a firearm. Not only have a firearm, but have a firearm that has a more powerful caliber than their weapon. And so we have created a kind of state of paranoid policing. What do you make of that?
Well, I would say that the problem with both, I would say the problem were not only guns, but also the people who have the power to use those guns. So that would sort of be my first. I mean, the police have been a problem in this country before there have been more guns than people. The police originated as a problem in this country because they were created partially in response to the growing slave population. They were trying to figure out how to resist the people who were uprising in the wake of slavery. And so I don't know if we've created a paranoid police form, but the police were created because of the public paranoia of Black resistance. Right. That's why we have police in the first place. So to say that, oh man, these police are just, they're just so paranoid because at any moment they can lose their life. Part of that is ahistorical. It wasn't as if they just emerged to have that. But ever since police were created as managers of inequality, they have been primarily tasked to manage the paranoid fears of the people who have wealth, the people who are able to repress people of color, but people who are responsible for indigenous genocide, the people who are paranoid about people crossing the borders that didn't exist before. So the history of policing is one of paranoia. So I don't think that's enough to say, it's a gun problem, even though, and as I talk about in chapter 5, there is a serious gun problem. There is it's horrible how many guns there are in the United States and how we're able to let, even after tragedy, national after national tragedy, what do you have? You have lots of people who are committed to still maintaining the presence of guns in this country. And a lot of them includes police. It's no accident that a lot of police department, people who belong to police departments are also members of Oath Keepers and other right-wing white militias. It's no surprise that police also joined the January Capitol 6 riots, right? So it's, on the one hand, I hear him trying to make that argument, but I would need him to also talk about police who defend the so-called right to bear arms. So you can't be critical of this problem in America if you're also a part of it. You're contributing to the gun culture. If you look at Jason Stockley in St. Louis in 2016 or 2017, he killed a young Black man with his own gun. He went to his car, didn't use his police issued weapon, his standard issued weapon. He grabbed a different gun and shot this Black man in his car, right? And what did the judge say? The judge defended the cop's actions. And he tried to use the paranoia, maybe this guy had a gun, but that cop used his own gun, right? And so I think they're both problems, and we have to eradicate both. We have to eradicate the rabid gun culture in the United States, and we have to eradicate police.
Mm-hmm. So you talk in the book, there's an interesting anecdote that you tell about your son, and the experience you had when you took him for manicure and pedicure, and it's connected to the bigger themes that you think about in the book. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, so Juice is just such a special child. Like, that's my baby. He's just such a special child, and it's been really interesting watching my ideas be challenged, right? My progressive ideas about the politics that I have, the viewpoints, all the talking points, all of that can be true. You can write it, you can talk about it, you can sing it. And then there comes a point where you have to practice what you preach. You have to live like this life. And parenting, more than anything, has pushed and challenged my radical politics and beliefs, right? It's challenged how truly progressive I am. And so one day I took, in the book I talk about when I take Juice to go get a pedicure and a manicure, and how we were initially refused service because he was a boy. And
how old was he? How old
Juice
was he
was
then?
5. He was 5.
Mm-hmm.
He was like 4 or 5 at the time. And so the nail tech, who happened to be a guy, was just like, oh, he's too young. And just like the week before, I saw this preschool teacher bring in a group of young girls to get their nails and feet done. I saw them have this whole little party. So I knew that wasn't true, because they were at least 3 years younger than Juice. It actually was one of the reasons why I took Juice to the shop. And so I was like, no, that's not true. I saw this, but I didn't want to argue with him. And so I was like, okay, well, just a manicure then. And so we have like another exchange, and then he just couldn't bring himself to say, like, he's a boy, I'm not going to do this. And so he does like the clipping, the soak, all of that stuff. And then he asks Juice, no color or clear. And then Juice says blue. And at that point, the whole nail shop is just like, right? It's like this audible gasp. The manicurist like looks at me like, clearly you're not about to let your son get like blue fingernail polish. And I was just like sweating. I was panicking. All of this over some blue nail polish, right? And so I go and pick the blue polish. I am like hot. I am like angry that I'm even in this position, that I feel overwhelmed about what's happening. And long story short, I tell the nail tech, to paint his nails blue. And while that's like in the moment, I don't know if I necessarily thought about police abolition, right? But I know in that moment, what I did feel was, well, this is how homophobia and transphobia, these sorts of moments, these sorts of fears, this is how they arise, right? It's wanting to control someone's behavior, wanting to police their genders, police their sexuality, police their appearances, right? So this is what leads people to then go and create and act on ideas of like hatred, right? Because of these small arbitrary ideas of what genitalia you have should determine whether you get nail polish or not. And so it's just so troubling that I then have fears about, do I send my kid to school with blue nail polish on? Is he going to be safe, right? Is he going to be bullied? Is he going to be attacked? And this, says nothing about like what Juice actually thinks or actually feels. It's just blue polish. Like, it has no social meaning outside of a color for him. But in the homophobic culture that we have, in the transphobic culture that we have, in the misogynistic culture that we have, for a little Black boy to have blue nails at 5 is so jarring. And I don't know if, did you know Ricky Lake and what was the other one? What were the talk shows in the 90s? Like Ricky Lake.
Oh yeah, my
and Jenny Jones. Was that the other one?
It sounds right. I wish I could have this on the tip of my tongue. Right. It's been a minute. It's been a minute, and
yes,
my memory is not what it once was.
Yeah. So when I was a kid, I used to watch Ricky Lake. I think the other one was like Jenny Jones with my mom, and they would have these like provocative topics. And one of the topics I remember was, Ohio mom lets boy child wear skirt to school. And the whole episode was about this. The entire episode was about a parent, a mom, who let her child, Sally Jones, thank you, would let her child. I think someone know what I'm talking about. Jesus. So
wait, was it Sally Jesse Raphael or
yes, is it Sally Raphael?
Yes, it's Sally Jesse Raphael and Jenny Jones. I think those are like different people.
I'm mixing them up. I know there was Ricky Lake, there was a Sally, and maybe there was a Jenny. So anyway, so yes.
And then there was like a sister too, whose name I should remember, but I don't.
Was it Star Jones?
No, not Star Jones.
No, okay. But I'm talking about the okay. So anyway, so I remember as a
kid, down the road of 90s talk shows, daytime talk shows.
Well, they were big deals. Jerry Springer, that whole era where like talk shows were like our social media stuff. So there would be whole entire hour-long episodes about a parent who decided to let a boy kid wear a skirt to school. And so I think that we've come so much more, like we've come so much far from where that was. Sadly, definitely not far enough, as we're seeing the rise of like trans bills being passed all across the country, anti-trans bills. But it's that culture that then leads someone to act on, that transphobic idea, that homophobic idea. You don't deserve to live. I get to kill you. You're wrong. You're different. You are not human. You're all of these ideas of what it means to be a person then gets to be policed by someone else who has power to act violently against them. And that's the culture that we have to undermine.
So, I guess a segue into this is, the chapter in which you talk about sexual violence and how it fits into this construct too. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's similar with the murder that I was just talking about. So, sexual violence, we have sexual violence for lots of reasons, not just because people are evil, but because people are conditioned, especially men, to be in control of the sexuality of others. And so there's so much sexual violence that happens in our country that police, and I mean throughout the world, that police just can't even respond to, because we either don't consider it to be sexual violence, or for those who do, you're less likely to call the police on someone who's harmed you, who you have a close relationship with, so a partner or a family member. Most people experience sexual violence from acquaintances, people that they know. And so the police cannot stop that, right? The police cannot intervene in those sorts of violence. And once again, they also perpetuate that violence, like within police departments and in our communities. And so if we want to eradicate sexual violence, we can't just police our way out of it. We can't continue to use VAWA as an excuse to give more money to police, who also, the second highest complaint against cops is sexual misconduct. After police brutality is sexual misconduct. So these are the people, this is the institution that we're relying on to solve sexual violence and end sexual violence. And it's completely insufficient. And so, what gives people, especially Black women who call the police for sexual violence more than other women, one of the main reasons is because of a social safety network. White women call the police less because they have more economic agency to leave relationships. And so how do we make sure that people have agency to leave relationships, to get divorces, to enter into relationships on their own terms, rather than, being in a situation and they're being sexually exploited by a partner because they need a house, because they need somewhere to live, because they need healthcare or benefits, because they need food. And so it's like, well, we can continue to maybe wait for police to arrest some of the people who may have committed sexual violence, or we can start investing in people and making sure they have resources to determine what kinds of living arrangements, make them safe, what kind of educational experiences on campuses make them safe. And so police become the cheap and violent way out. And abolition is a call for an actual investment in what actually keeps people safe, and which includes the eradication of that rape culture.
So you talk a lot about, or not a lot, but a good deal about your experience at Harvard, and how formative that was to you, and kind of can you talk a little bit about how you came to attend Harvard Law School, and the ways in which it impacted your perspective and the work you're doing now?
That's a really good. What do you mean the way, like the specific way I came to attend Harvard Law School, or
Oh, I mean, like the kind of sense of like your mother gave you two career choices.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. I was like, well, that's a different story. So yeah, when I was a kid, I talk about in the book, my mom told me I had to be a lawyer, a doctor. And one of the reasons, because I had to buy her a house, which I tell her all the time, I'm never going to be that kind of lawyer, mama. I don't got that kind of money. So I'm not sorry to let you down. I'm not going to be able to buy you a house. But she also definitely believed in all of the Black history heroes I was telling you about, and believed that we needed Black civil rights lawyers to help defend people who are always or typically on the losing side. And so as early as like 4 or 5 years old, I had known that I was going to be a lawyer. And because of most of my organizing experiences, I mean, I had been an activist, I was like 14 years old. And so I had thought that I was going to be an education civil rights lawyer because of my, experiences with the desegregation program in St. Louis, like that story desegregation case. St. Louis was a huge site of busing from the city to the county, which actually played out again in the Ferguson uprising, and then again with the loss of accreditation and Black people losing democratic control over their cities. And so that I always sort of had, for lack of a better word, is law school is my North Star. Like, this is the place I have to go. You know, my mom got kicked out of high school. She was like 14 years old, you know, so she wasn't able to go to college. So she was like, you know, you have to go to college. You have to go to law school. You sort of have to be the one. And I was also the oldest of 6 kids. And so it was just like, well, how do you like, what do you do? How do you find resources to get to law school, to get to this place? And so, yeah, that I am grateful for having someone who constantly pushed me, we always had a library in our house. No matter wherever we lived, whatever slum apartment we slept in, my mom always kept a bookcase, always kept books there, always made us read, always asked us and engaged us in critical thinking and debate and current events, right? So I was very fortunate to grow up in that kind of a household, which makes me frustrated when people say, you know, how are you going to make abolition or socialism or any of these radical progressive politics accessible to people in the hood? And I'm like, do y'all know people in the hood? Do y'all talk to people? Do y'all listen to people? There's so much diversity and ideas and thinking and dreams and aspirations for people in our communities. And so I felt very lucky to grow up under a mom who was a writer, and a grandma who is also a writer and a poet, who you know, were very, very, very poor. I mean, very, very class exploited women, but still, you know, pushed me to think critically about who I wanted to be in the world, and made sure that, you know, each step of the way that I was gonna be there. So I would say that's like the condensed version of how I ended up, you know, at law school.
And you talk about, you know, Belinda Hall and, you know, Harvard, and, you know, what you took from that experience too. Oh, well, before I say that, before I bring up that question, we're going to go to Q&A in about 3 minutes. And so if you have a question, you know, that you're formulating, you can go ahead and submit it now, and hopefully we can get to it on the other side of this. So can you just give like a kind of capsule of, you know, what you took from the experience at Harvard?
Well, so much. I think one of the most important things that I took away from that time in law school, which was at a very, very, very crucial time, you know, in the United States. There were all these uprisings that were happening. And then in the broader world, there were so many, I mean, global liberation movements that were happening. So I was in law school at a very, very particular time. And I don't know what kind of lawyer, what kind of person I would be had I not gone when I went. And so one thing that I learned actually from students in South Africa is just the importance of political education, right? Having the political analysis and doing that work with other people to then inform the kind of world you want to fight for, which is very different than what I had learned most of my life, which is, you know, you learn, you get smart, you like display how smart you are by accumulating degrees or being able to give talking points succinctly and convey your ideas through writing. But I met so many students all across the world who were not reading and not studying to do those things, right? They were reading and studying to then figure out what kinds of people they wanted to be and what kind of fights they wanted to engage in. And so that is like the most important, the most transformative thing that could have happened to me, I think. And now as I think about the political homes that I'm in now, it's a huge feature of what's happening, right? I think it's unfair when I talk to cops and I'm on panels. I've stopped doing panels with cops because I would have to know all of their stuff. I have to know sociology. I have to know history. I have to be able to speak to crime statistics. I have to know all of their counter arguments. And then you ask a cop, you know, who's very adamant that abolition is unrealistic and is making their jobs hard. What have you read? None of them has, like, none of the ones I've ever encountered have to seriously engage any of our ideas for liberation. And what you see in the political homes I belong to and the organizing spaces I belong to is that we know their stuff frontwards and backwards. any of the hard questions, the what about the murderers, what about the sexual violence, what are we going to do when this happens? We are asking those questions of ourselves very seriously and more critically than any of the times that we've been asked for people who don't belong to those spaces. And so I find so much value in that. And so much freedom in that, and not knowing all the answers, but being with people who are committed to figuring out those answers together and creating answers, because ultimately abolition is about the path that we forge.
And so we could talk, for another hour, but I want to make sure that we have space for the questions, that are here. So if Andy wants to jump in.
Hi. Yes, as Jelani said, if you have a question, now is the time to type it in to the chat so that we can hopefully get to it. We have one or two already, and thanks for everyone who's already commented. Got people watching from Maryland and Minneapolis and St. Paul, and someone who grew up in Missouri. So hello, everyone. Here is a question from Maggie. Say, I'm at the part in the first chapter where you're talking about your troubles you had with what was being said at your church and comments you heard that were homophobic. Can you talk about how today you feel your faith influences you being an abolitionist or vice versa?
Wow. Every time I get a question about faith and abolition, I always stumble about how to respond to it because it's something that I'm actively working out. So I consider myself a person of faith. I consider myself a Christian. I don't consider myself to be evangelistic in the way that I was, especially in the first chapter of that book. I think that the easiest way that I've been able to communicate it is in terms of the relationship about my faith and how it influenced my abolition perspective, is that what was this? A couple of weeks ago, someone asked me a similar question, and I just said, I got very, very tired of praying to God about safety from police, safety from white supremacy, and safety from all these forms of oppression. And just one way that I hope, that one thing that I want for other people who are people of faith, is just the freedom to pray, to talk to God about more interesting things, right? Like what would our relationship with God or whatever deity that we're in a relationship with, what would that look like if we didn't have to pray for our kids to be safe once they left our homes? Right? We didn't have to pray, oh man, I hope this cop doesn't stop me. That fear that creates a sweat in the back of your neck when you're driving. What if we didn't have to stop and pray to God from alleviation from those sorts of burdens? What other kinds of people could we become? How stronger could our faith be? What sorts of risks would we be willing to take? What would our prayers sound like, right? What would be the things that we would agonize over or be curious about if we didn't have to pray against exploitation, right? Or there would be enough food in our home. It's my commitment to figuring out how people can pray different types of prayers. So the more that we can meet the material needs of people on earth right now, hopefully then people will be able to pray for other kinds of things. And it's great that people obviously pray for all different types of things now, but I am absolutely curious about what would be the substance of our prayers, right? Had we had much of our material needs met.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question.
Yeah. And I'm going to skip down to a question from Tom that I see here. Recognizing the value of police investigations to combat impunity, as well as their widespread failure with low clearance rates, how do police investigations fit in to your vision of abolition?
I need to know what they mean by police investigations.
Tom, if you are there, let us know what you mean by police investigations. Otherwise, we'll guess.
You want to do another question?
Yeah. So here's another one from Maggie. I feel like when I went through undergrad, it required me to close in on myself, to protect myself, to just get through. Did you feel at times that law school felt limiting?
Oh, yeah. Yes. I feel law school felt limiting, as I feel legal practice feels limiting, right? The beautiful thing is that we don't have to be just lawyers, right? I am very grateful when I think about people like Paul Robeson, everyone obviously can't be Paul Robeson because we can't be like beautiful international opera singer, lawyer, athletes, right? We can't do all of this, right? We can't. But what's incredible about people like Paul Robeson and lots of people who are in the Black radical tradition, it's great that they do lots of different things to try to figure out like what liberation looks like, right? So I'm grateful that I get to be a lawyer and I get to use my skills as a lawyer for different organizations that they need it. But I'm also grateful to be able to write, right? To think publicly about ideas with people who are curious about them. I'm also grateful to be an organizer, to build campaigns and have a political home that's different from my legal work and that's different from my like more journalistic work, right? I have the freedom to do political work that's not paid, that's in struggle, that's hoping to build something more transformative. And so I think it's great that these spaces get to be limited, I guess, but they don't have to be the only spaces that we have. We get to decide, many of us, how we want to spend our time. And I feel very lucky and very fortunate to spend our time, to spend my time at least doing things besides like what the law allows. And then, okay, so I see the.
Yeah, it looks like he answered.
Yes, to solve murders. Yeah, I think I hate to do this, but I don't know if I agree in that there is a value of police investigations in solving murders, especially given the clearance rates, right? The clearance rates are so low. Unless we're just satisfied again with like more than 70% of people potentially just not who could kill people and nothing can absolutely happen. Yes, I will hope that, and then, again, this is over time. What we're trying to do is eradicate what leads to those encounters that leads to a homicide. And a lot of the trainings that I do with organizations, we talk about why people kill people, or we talk about the reasons why people kill people. And so it's not as simple as like, I like using homicide more than murder because the category, we get to save more lives than just to figure out how do we, stop people from intentionally killing people. But I think that police investigations are unfortunately maybe considered valuable because we haven't taken that time, especially as a society, to undermine the root causes of harm. And if you read police reports, there are a lot of federal reports where the federal government, at least it's like 1990, 1980s, these reports I was reading and including the book, you have police admitting that police operate on top of society. We can't get to the root causes of harm. That's not what we're intended to do. Sometimes we lock up people. A lot of times we lock up the wrong people. Sometimes we pin multiple murders to someone just to increase that clearance rate. So it's valuable in the sense that there aren't a lot of other options, right? There's not like clickbait where you have a lot of people trying to solve a murder for a social media show, right? What you have is that police are the default solution. So then it seems valuable because they're the only people that's doing it, but that doesn't mean that it's then eradicating like the actual murders. A lot of people, especially people who commit community-based violence, they're not going to be discouraged from, retaliating against someone or preempting a murder by killing someone to save their own life. Police, the threat of jail or violence may not be enough because if there's an immediate threat in my life, I'm going to stop that threat. The United States unfortunately understands that and uses drones to preemptively strike and start war, kill people in other countries. But in interpersonal, when it's like, well, this person's going to kill me if I don't kill this person first, it's like, well, that person's a murderer. It's like, well, no, there's much more complex issues that we can get to and eliminate if we take our time and we invest in them instead of defaulting to police and then say this is valuable what they do. And so I hope that by the time we get to the place where police are eradicated, the 15,000 murders that happen every year, we're also changing the conditions so there's not 15,000 murders every year. So maybe if we get to 1,000 murders or 500 murders or 200 murders, maybe we can actually get to the accountability and decide what it means for those 200 people who kill people. But right now we're at 15,000 and we're defaulting to police, and they're doing a worse job, an increasingly worse job of figuring out how to hold anyone accountable for that.
Yeah, I think it's a process, right? Like,
Yeah.
I think that sometimes gets lost in the conversation is, it's going to take a while. So here is an interesting question from just CS. What do you believe have been the most nefarious police-centered or punitive responses to the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic? What abolitionist alternatives do you suggest?
I love this question so much because one thing that you can do is go to the COVID-19 policing project that I helped to create with Andrea Ritchie. There's an entire report that we did that tracked COVID-19 policing responses with the help of Pascal Emmer. And what we did was look at how all of the police across the country were tasked with enforcing the public health orders, right? And so different states, different cities, they passed different public health emergency orders related to COVID. Some of them were around quarantine, some of them were around curfew, some of them were around social distancing, and police were mask wearing too. Police were tasked with then enforcing these orders, many times not wearing masks themselves, not social distancing themselves. If you look at, so we have an entire report dedicated precisely to this question, including abolitionist responses that would have alleviated police violence and saved lives, and what we should be thinking about now that we're experiencing new variants of the virus. So if you Google COVID-19 policing project or go to the Community Resource Hub for Safety and Accountability, if you go to that website, you'll be able to see the entire report as well as those responses.
Wow, that was a great question.
Really
awesome answer. All right, so we are going to take one final question from Gabriel, and I would like to hear maybe an answer from both of you to close it out. Who are the abolitionists that have influenced or inspired you the most?
Oh, wow. So there are people who are like famous or becoming famous now, right? So there's like Angela Davis, there's George Jackson, there's Ruth Wilson Gilmore, there's Miriam Kaba, right? There's, that entire camp of people. There are people like Rachel Herzing, who I think, especially around police abolition, Rachel Herzing has influenced me more than anyone specifically around policing. And I'm very grateful for the work that Rachel has done with the Center for Political Education. And then there are people who I organize with, right, who are figuring out how to reduce the power of police and who are also responding to actual violence in our communities. So people like that are like Mike Milton, Caleb Reed in St. Louis, so many Dream Defenders who are doing community-based organizing, mutual aid work, and fighting against the carceral state. So like Rachel Gilmer and Jonelle. I'm inspired by so many people constantly, like in the United States. I'm inspired by Talib Salud in Puerto Rico, who does street violence interruption work in one of the neighborhoods with the highest homicide rates on the island. They do that work without policing. So I'm incredibly inspired by that work. And so I feel so grateful that so many people have been doing this for such a long time. And now like other people get to be inspired and get to be influenced by them. And if you go through the book, you'll see endless examples of people who've touched my life and who continue to touch the lives of others.
Yeah, I think as my role as moderator, I'll just kind of defer and say that I have been inspired over the course of the past 7 years since we met to see the path that Derecka has forged and the work that she's done, and to see that she's just continuing and working in so many different directions and working very hard at trying to deliver actual good in the world. And so I think I find that inspirational.
Thank you, John. It's so kind of you. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you both so much. Thank you everyone who tuned in. If there's anyone who who registered and wasn't able to watch live, this video does remain available on the Majors and Quinn YouTube channel for people to tune in if they missed it. And there is information about purchasing copies of Becoming Abolitionists up in the chat. So thank you everyone once again. Have a wonderful rest of your evening. Bye.